why don't we just launch right in? I have a bunch of questions for you on a variety of topics, but I'm hoping to focus on this book. I have some questions about psi phenomena as well, and some other things that you work on. But let me start like this. So some of the ideas that you enumerate in the book were sort of new on me. And it was a new way for me to consider the concept of morality in general. And I sort of felt like I was introduced to like a whole world, like a whole discussion that's been taking place for a long time that I just was unaware of. And I sort of like stepped into it and I was like, wow, like there's all this terminology and all this thinking has already been done. And so it took me a while to sort of like bone up on the lingo that you guys use when you discuss these things.
Yeah, sure.
And so, I think I made a little progress, but I found it fascinating and I have some clarifying questions. So to start with, actually, the back cover, you talk about this inside the book also, but the back cover says, when we feel pleasure, we are feeling intrinsic goodness itself. And that idea really hit me. And I've been mulling it over for like 2 weeks, trying to see if it feels right. And I thought of a couple of examples to try to illustrate a counterpoint to it. And I would love to know what you think of it. So number one is, did you see the movie Barbarella by any chance?
No.
With Jane Fonda? It's this very campy sci-fi film from the 60s. It doesn't really matter. But there's a bad guy named Duran Duran, where the band takes its name from. And he attempts to kill Barbarella, the Jane Fonda character, in something called an extensive machine, which induces fatal sexual pleasure, meaning that he was killing her through pleasurable sensations. Okay, so that would be like an example one. If pleasure is intrinsic goodness, then would we say that what was happening to her was a great good? And then as an opposite sort of example, I was thinking like maybe like a field amputation during World War I, which is horrifically painful, but ultimately good. So what do we do with examples like that when we consider this concept?
So you definitely want to make a distinction between intrinsic goodness and instrumental goodness. And I spend a lot of time on that, and it's so crucial to understanding the point that I'm trying to make about the intrinsic goodness of pleasure. So if we look at the case of the movie and the dying of sexual pleasure case, so first we can look at the intrinsic goodness of what's happening, or the intrinsic properties of what's happening. The feeling of this is just, this is ecstatic, this is ecstasy, this, the height of the pleasure that a person can feel. And so from that interior perspective, from the perspective of just looking at the qualities of the state itself, the goodness is off the charts.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you look at the consequences of this, of what this brings about, for whatever reason, this short circuits her brain or, fries her nervous system or whatever it is. And so she dies from this.
She doesn't actually. The machine dies.
She doesn't. Oh, okay.
She outlasts it.
See? Well, in the case where somebody might die from this, let's say, that's relative to the instrumental goodness or badness of that state. But that's separate from what is intrinsically. So its effects are different from what it is in itself.
Uh-huh.
And that's going to be the same with the person who's being amputated on the battlefield. So the feeling as it's happening itself is, one of the worst things that we might imagine. But the result of it is something that ultimately is going to allow this person to experience life, experience other good things in their life down the line. So it has instrumental goodness despite its intrinsic badness.
That's interesting. And so would you say that there's like a hierarchical distinction between levels of goodness? So meaning, for instance, it seems to me that in the battlefield case, like the ultimate goodness of the result certainly outweighs whatever negativity, badness happens because of the pain. I think most people would be willing to make that trade. And so it seems like the result weighs more than whatever the experience is. So is there a hierarchy of pleasures? Is there a hierarchy of goodness and badness?
Well, there are degrees of pleasure, right? So, you can have more or less pleasure in a particular moment. You could say, or just like we, rate our pain in the hospital on a scale of, 0 to 10, right? You can rate how much pain you're feeling. You can rate how much pleasure you're feeling as well. And it actually turns out that people are pretty good at doing this consistently over time. There used to be some doubt about whether people really had a handle on how to, give specific numbers to the pleasure and pain that they were feeling.
Mm-hmm.
But various experiments have shown that actually people could rate these pretty consistently. So we have different degrees of pleasure or pain within a specific moment. But then, of course, over the course of an entire life, you have many different moments with many different levels of pleasure and pain. And so when you're deciding what you want to do, what you want to seek out, you have to take into account not only what it's going to feel like in this moment, but what it's going to feel like at all of these other moments for the rest of your life, and how it's going to make all of the other people or other conscious beings that you affect, how it's going to make them feel.
Right. Which is a separate and additionally important question, I think, which is how do you know that that's important? And I guess we can get there, but let's take a step back for a second and let's sort of like give like the 30,000 foot understanding of this notion to begin with of moral realism versus anti-realism. Could you explain, for the benefit of the audience who may not know those terms, what they mean and why they're important?
Yeah. So moral realism is basically the idea that there is objective truth in morality. So there are either certain actions that are objectively good, others that are objectively bad, or there are certain states of affairs, ways that the world can be that are objectively better than other ways the world could be. And that does not depend on what we think about it, the judgments that our culture makes or we as individuals make. It's something that is true in virtue of the way those things are on their own. Moral anti-realism says, no, actually, there's no objective fact of the matter about whether certain actions are better or worse than others, or certain states of affairs are better or worse than others. It's something else is going on. So moral anti-realists disagree about exactly how we should understand the meaning of the moral claims that we make. Some of them will say, well, it's just your subjective opinion. You're just stating your opinion about something, or you're saying you're expressing what you like and what you don't like about the world.
Preferences.
But there are other much more complex systems, such as constructivism, that would say, well, what is right or wrong for you depends on your whole web of beliefs and values that you hold. And so you can actually be wrong in thinking that, you ought to do a certain thing, because if you really reflected on what your deepest values are, you would see that that's not really in line with that. So even on moral anti-realism, people can make mistakes, quote unquote, about what is good or bad, but they're making mistakes with reference to their own set of values. Whereas in moral realism, you would be making a mistake with respect to something that is completely independent of any of your values or judgments.
Okay, that makes sense. And to quote you once again from the book, you say, you're talking about value, and I'm not sure what the difference between, and maybe you can explain this also, the difference between value and morality. But you say value, if it is part of the intrinsic nature of the world, it's possibly part of the intrinsic nature of persons, human beings. we could be connected to the objective value of the world in virtue of being part of that world and embodying some of its value in ourselves. Okay, so all of these approaches seem to posit that there is such a thing as morality, whether it's objective or subjective, right? Whether I've decided it or whether it exists somewhere in the world. So my question is, why? Is there some set of behaviors that is discoverable in reality? Or are you saying like just the very fact, the brute fact of the pleasurableness is the answer to that? That is how we know that it's moral. Because otherwise, I don't think you can test for this in a lab. I don't think you can pour a cup of morality. I don't think it can be measured in Celsius or any measurement that we know of. How else might we know that it exists?
Well, that's one of the major questions that confronts any moral realist. And I think that it's one of the reasons that moral anti-realism has been so popular, at least during a certain period in the last few decades, because it's so hard to see how, if there is something out there that is the objective rightness or wrongness of actions, how is it that we're learning about it? Like, okay, maybe there is an objective truth to morality, but like, it doesn't seem like we can see it with our eyes, or like you said, you can't pour it into a test tube. You can't measure it in these ways that we normally think of our ability to measure things. So how is it that we are able to have true beliefs about it? If indeed we do have true beliefs, where are we getting our knowledge about this objective morality? And that's actually the primary question that motivated me in my study of metaethics, which is what this whole field is called, this meta look at what ethics is. I wanted to know, okay, how is it that we could somehow have a connection to the moral structure of the world, the deep, some deep structure of the world that would make some things better than others? And ultimately, I think that where we make that epistemic connection, that knowledge connection, is through the actual experience of pleasure or the experience of pain. Mm-hmm. Because when we are experiencing that thing, it's in a sense, we are that experience, or that experience is part of us at the moment that we are experiencing it. We are acquainted with what its inner nature is in a way that we aren't acquainted with the inner nature of the physical objects outside of us. But that pleasure, what pleasure is this experience that we're having. And we experience in that moment that this is something good. Mm-hmm. This is something that the world is better. My life is better because this moment of pleasure is part of it. And yes. If we're experiencing pain, it's like, no, this is, if this was all that life was, life would not be worth living. This is the antithesis of goodness and something that would give purpose and meaning to life.
So what you said there is very interesting. I think most people, and when we talk about ethics and morality, we're generally talking about interactions between people and maybe between people and animals. But I think that there are moments that human beings have that they label as good, even though there is no moral decision-making taking place. So for instance, someone's walking through the park and sees the sunlight coming through the leaves, and they stop and they say, somehow, some part of them says, this is good. Mm-hmm. I've had that, this feels right. This feels good. And I've wondered, like, why? Why should that be anything? It's just some, photons, coming through these plants. And, why should that matter at all? Or a sunset or the natural world seems to have a lot of that for people, but there's other experiences. But what would you do with someone like the Marquis de Sade, for instance, who took sadistic pleasure in what we would normatively call hurting other people. I don't think he was insane, to the best of my knowledge, so we can't just pin it on that. It seems to me that he took the anti-realist position to its logical conclusion. Maybe it's just well, there is no objective morality, and I enjoy this personally, and therefore it's good for me. What would a moral realist be able to say to someone like that, or to a culture that collectively holds that hurting people of a certain category is perfectly fine? I don't know, the Taliban comes to mind, Nazis come to mind, this whole order of people we deem them as worthless, or actually as cancerous, and therefore to attack them is good, How do we make sense of that? That was a lot, sorry.
Yeah, no. So from my own perspective, I think that what's going wrong there is that those people who are, torturing people for the pleasure that they get out of it, or, that their society somehow reaps from that, they are focused solely on their own pleasure. They're not focused on the pleasure for all of the beings who are involved in their activity. Mm-hmm. And so what is wrong with what they're doing is all of the pain that it's causing to others. So that's what's wrong with it. Now, whether you can reason with those people and show them that it's wrong and convince them to behave differently, I don't know if that's always possible. I don't, I don't know. I think there are some people that you can, but I think there are also, there are individuals and situations that maybe you can't reason people out of them. They are very myopic in the way that they're perceiving the world, and they're not going to be swayed to care about others. But that doesn't mean that those others aren't worth being cared about.
Sure.
Because in order for a torturer to think that what they're doing is okay, they have to be screening themselves off from the perspective of the other person or animal that is involved in what's going on. So there's some sense, of course, in which they're aware of the pain because that's what they're getting off on. But at the same time, they are aware of that pain as being the pain of someone else. It is not their own pain, mm-hmm. right? And so they're leaving this epistemic distance, this distance of knowledge. They're not taking the perspective of the others. They aren't capturing in their own mind what the pain is actually like for the other individual involved. And if they were truly representing that to themselves as it is, then I think they would understand why that is wrong. But there's for whatever reason, they're not truly representing the pain that the other person is feeling.
Right. Not representing, not caring, or having justified it in some way that it's for an ultimate good, in the same way that, they might say that eradicating cancer, even though cancer is living cells, is ultimately good. I guess you can't perfectly analogize it. I don't know if the cancer doesn't want to be killed, Well,
it probably doesn't. So it's, I'm certainly not arguing that that we shouldn't ever cause pain. Because we were talking about the amputation on the battlefield. There are cases where we all agree, yes, that pain should be allowed in this case because it's for the person's long-term good, or it's for the long-term good of the group or the society.
Right. Okay, good. So actually, this is a good segue into my next question, which is about the appearance of bad. So let's talk just emotionally, not in terms of like horrific physical pain. But you know those situations where something occurs and you say, I can't believe this happened. This is the worst possible timing. This is the worst thing that could have happened. And you feel very, very horrific about it and you brood about it. And you're like, and we've all had that experience, you know, where in the moment, or it could even last for years. And later it gets reframed by circumstances. And then we might say to ourselves, you know what, that was the best thing that could possibly have happened to me, you know, and I just couldn't see it from my perspective then, but you know, I had to make a change and this forced me to do it. And now my life is great because of this terrible thing that happened. So the emotional pain that someone experiences during that period of time, would you say that that's an actual bad? Or is it some kind of masked good that we just don't yet understand?
So we talked before about intrinsic goodness, instrumental goodness, but there's also a term that I use in my book, which is goodness, all things considered. So which is generally, I think, what we mean when we say that something is good, or like, you know, in the big picture, it's something that's good. Right. It's this all things considered goodness. We're considering the intrinsic qualities. We're considering all the effects that it has, you know, forever and, you know, into the future. And once we've taken into consideration all of those things, the sum of all of that is positive, then we say all things considered, it's good. It has all things considered goodness. And it could be intrinsically bad. It could feel really terrible in the moment, like you're saying, or it could feel really bad for 4 or 5 years, a long time. But then there's all of this other goodness that it produces that comes to outweigh that. And so all things considered, it was a good.
Okay.
It didn't feel good at the time, but it was good, all things considered.
Okay, we're on the same page with that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how I would see it. Let's ask an even potentially deeper question, deeper philosophical question about all this, which is, do you identify any type of purpose to the intrinsic bad? Is there any meta purpose to it? You know, some people could argue it was a learning experience, or something that I had to go through for, you know, for my own development, or whatever it is. How do you feel about it? Is badness just random? It's like something that occurs because it occurs, or could there be some overarching value by itself to it?
So this isn't something that I deal with in that book, The Feeling of Value, but it is a question that I have wrestled with a lot. It's actually something that I'm writing about in my current book, which is a sequel to The Feeling of Value. So it's definitely something that I have thought about a lot. And I think it's definitely possible that suffering always has a purpose. There are a lot of people who've had near-death experiences, which you've talked a lot about on this show. There are a lot of people who've had these experiences who say, well, when I was, you know, on the other side, while I was temporarily dead, I knew so much more about the world. Like it was just like my consciousness completely expanded, and I understood all these things about how the world works. And one of the things I understood is that all of the suffering that we go through, there is a purpose to it. Like it all makes sense from the other side. And I remember specifically a young Jewish woman who was talking about, she had been an atheist for her almost her whole life. As soon as she had learned about the Holocaust, she was like, I just can't believe that that there is a God. I can't believe that there is a meaning and purpose behind this. And then when she had this experience, her near-death experience, she was like, actually, she had always been thinking that if, you know, there was an afterlife, that when she got there, she was going to like berate God and be like, how could you do all of these things? But when she actually did have this experience of meeting this, you know, divine being of some kind, she was engulfed with this knowledge, understanding, that it totally does make sense. There was another case I remember of a woman who had been molested for years as a child, And she had the same feeling. She was like, there's no way that this could be part of any kind of good plan. But when she had her near-death experience, at least while she was there on the other side, she's like, I understood it. I knew that this is the way that it had to be. I knew that this was serving a purpose. But she says when she came back, she's like, I can't understand it from here anymore. She's like, I still, I can't explain to like a parent who's lost a child. I can't tell them why this happened. It's so terrible. She says, all I can remember is that from the other side, I did know that there was a reason. And so I'm open to the possibility that it might all make sense from some larger perspective. At the same time, from our perspective here, I don't. It feels sometimes like, telling somebody who's going through a terrible experience, oh, well, it's all for the best. Like, that's not going to be very helpful to them.
No, it's like the worst thing to say.
No. So we have to understand our current perspective as well and adjust for that, and not think that, well, if it's true that ultimately everything serves a good purpose, that we can be in a state to understand and know that here. Like sometimes here is often just really hard. We are going through a lot of pain. We're going through a lot of suffering, and sometimes it is easier and maybe even better in the long term to just say, it just seems random. It just seems terrible. Like, I don't know why this is happening, but I just have to get through it.
Yes. So I think it's a pivotal thing that you're saying here. Because whether or not you can understand the ultimate reason for the suffering that one is going through in the here and now, the simple belief that it is for some ultimate purpose is the difference to me between a satisfying, sane existence, and one that is just a slog and a very, very cognitively miserable period of time to go through this life. And that's why I feel that it's of just extreme value for people just to be introduced to the concept, as you just did. And a lot of people are citing near-death experience now, which personally makes me happy, as evidence for, the possibility, let's say, of a much bigger picture to reality than most people have considered, or many people. But I think that simple knowledge would improve people's lives tremendously, because you can endure, I forget the famous quote of like, you can endure any what as long as you have a why. But if you don't, if it's just all meaningless activity, day in and day out, and you have no idea why some people prosper and some people suffer, life is hard. Like, it's like tremendously hard. So, and I appreciate that you brought that up, because I wanted to pivot into, the more of the I think that we were discussing a transcendental matter to begin with, which is morality. But I appreciate the fact that you brought up that kind of example of near-death experience to illustrate it. And you also explore what's called psi phenomena, paranormal research, which I also am fascinated by. And, I did a little looking online into some of what you've done. And I know you've published other books, which I recommend that people go check out on this topic. But let's talk for a minute about apparitions. Something that I think a lot of people would be disinclined to accept as a possibility. Although I know a lot of people, just people I know myself, I hear a lot of reports about it, whether or not they sort of like brush it aside as soon as possible and never, bring it up again. But I personally know half a dozen people who have told me very weird stories that I don't think they ever fully processed. But is a very interesting case that you call the Sarah Clark case. Would you be able to explain just a minute about that story? And I guess given the prevalence of reports like this, why is it that they're so easily dismissed?
Okay. So let me make sure I've got the right case. The Sarah Clark case, this is the maid.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So this is a case from the late 1800s. Mid 1800s, actually, I think. I think this is from Robert Dale Owen's book, which this is just an aside, but I used to teach a course on utopian communities when I was teaching at your alma mater, Brandeis University, and we studied Robert Dale Owen as founder of the utopian community. So when I later learned that he had written this book about apparitions and death-related phenomena, it was just very interesting to see. Well, here was another guy who was interested in both of these. The person that was interested in both of these things. In any case, so the this particular case, there was this young woman who was, I think she was visiting an aunt in upstate New York. Her aunt had this big house that had been in the family for a while, I think, and there was one of the rooms in the house, one of the bedrooms, was considered to be haunted. I guess, people had reported seeing something there. And one night when this young woman was staying with her aunt, she ended up having to sleep in that particular bedroom for whatever reason. And she woke up in the middle of the night, and even though her bedroom door was locked from the inside, so she had locked it, I guess, so nobody could come in the room, she saw someone in the room with her. There was this figure that I think she said was dressed like a servant of some kind, a female servant who's coming and was kind of like bending over the bed toward her, like trying to say something, and nothing was coming out, or she couldn't hear anything. So I think she just threw the covers over her head and hoping that it would go away. And I guess that it did. But then sometime later, she was hanging out with a friend in another location, and they decided to do some, spirit communication. This was all the rage back then. So they were using, I think, a planchette, which is sort of like a Ouija board, but like kind of rolls over things. And they ended up getting this message from somebody that nobody knew, but this message from somebody who identified herself as Sarah Clark and said that she had been a maid in her aunt's home, and that when she had been a maid there, she had stolen something. I think she said she had stolen a silver bowl, or a silver sugar bowl, I think. And she said that she had been coming back and trying to apologize and get forgiveness for having done this. So, of course, this young woman, after that, she has to go back to her aunt and say, look, there was this communication. Did you ever have a maid named Sarah Clark? And the aunt said that, yes, in fact, some years ago, her family had a maid by that name. And in fact, some objects had gone missing while that maid was there, including a silver sugar bowl, but they had never suspected this woman of stealing anything, because apparently she was just very well regarded by the family. They'd never suspected that. And the aunt, even after hearing what the spirit message said, still felt like this was not true, she said. But if it is true, she said, then I forgive her, and, she can go in peace. She doesn't need to worry about this anymore. And apparently after that time, the bedroom was no longer haunted. Nobody ever saw an apparition in that bedroom again.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So that would seem to be impossible for that person to know that information any other way. And so therefore the part two of that question, which is like, why is it considered so National Enquirer? Why is it so laughed at when so many people seem to have reports like this?
Oh, it's a very good question. I think the main reason is that it doesn't fit with the primary conception of reality that our society holds to. It doesn't fit with the with the scientific values of our society, with the sort of the hierarchy of knowledge that we have, that's, says that, things that we can study in a laboratory, those are the realest of real things. And anything that doesn't show up there, well, that's not really real. That's just a figment of your imagination. So it doesn't fit that picture. It doesn't. So anybody who reports something like that has to be considered to be, not quite right in the head, or, superstitious, or they're just, just inclined to
wild imagination,
believe silly things. Yeah. It cannot, our society, or the whole structure of knowledge in our society would be threatened by allowing that things like that really happen, because it brings into question everything else that we as a society acknowledge as being true.
Right. But isn't it a scientific principle to be open to changing your point of view based on new evidence?
It is. It is indeed. And there are a lot of scientists who actually are very interested in this sort of thing. Some of them are openly interested in it, but most of them are interested in it behind closed doors.
Right.
So they're not, for all of these reasons we just discussed, they're not going to say this in a public setting. But if you get them alone and you say, these weird things have happened to me. Have you ever had anything weird like that happen to you? Like, oh, yeah, I think there's a lot that we don't understand about the world. But it threatens your status as a scientist or as a scholar to admit that publicly. And it also, it puts you in a position where you have to acknowledge there's just so much that we don't know. Like, if this stuff is real, if these apparitions are real communications from a personality that's somehow continuing in some way, then what we have understood about the physical world through our last few hundred years of scientific research, it's like this tiny little speck
right,
compared to everything that's real in the universe.
Right.
Which, I think even physicalist, materialist scientists would say, well, yeah, that's true. Like, there's way more to the universe than what we recognize, and we're going to continue making all of these huge scientific leaps in the next 100 years. But when it comes to an actual paradigm shift, when it comes to the specific evidence, this new evidence that threatens it threatens not just a particular conception of the world, but really it threatens the whole way that we do science. Like, if you can influence, if the mind, it can influence things at a distance, then it threatens all of the controlled laboratory experiments that we do, because it means that the people doing the experiments might be influencing what's happening, not in any material way, but just with their mind. They might be influencing the outcomes. And then how do you control anything? There's all of this connectedness once we start to accept that consciousness might be more integral to the nature of the world than we've realized. So it upsets a lot of things. Right. And I understand why a lot of people are very nervous about opening that can of worms.
Me too, but I hope that they do open it.
Yeah.
And I have time for one more question only, unfortunately, but
wow.
45 minutes already went by. So really just to follow up on what you were just saying, and that was really a very, I think, thorough and very excellent explanation of that phenomena. Do you personally envision a time when psi phenomena will be mainstream, where the scientific and philosophical communities will take it as a matter of course that this is the way, this is part of the nature of reality? And if so, how long do you think that might be till we get there?
Yeah. So I think that it is possible. It's not like it's impossible for us to get there, because most of the societies on the planet actually take this very seriously. I mean, it's societies that have existed historically, and really the majority of societies today on our planet take this very seriously. So I can see how we could integrate those beliefs with our more scientific approach to the world. How long it will take, I don't know, because what's so seductive about the physicalist, materialist science is the technologies that it produces, its repeatability, the way that it allows us to control physical processes. And I think that's why it's become so powerful in the world. And I think that that's going to continue to drive a lot of its power within the scientific and scholarly communities. The thing with psi is that, and with various extraordinary spiritual phenomena, they're not repeatable in that way.
Right.
They are partly, I think, because they are aimed at that all things considered good that we're talking. They're aimed at a much bigger purpose. For individuals, they seem to be aimed at helping those individuals get through really difficult situations in their life and helping them develop into more whole, more loving, more people that feel more pleasure. I was trying to think of like an adjective for somebody that lives a pleasure-filled life. I don't know if we have a good word for that, but
hedonistic, but that's a pejorative.
But it's so pejorative. So anyway, I think these psi phenomena are really, they're working in this very holistic way to improve individual lives and help the planet as a whole, I think, evolve in a more positive direction. But for that reason, you can't manipulate them the same way that you can manipulate physical things.
Right.
And so they're not going to lend themselves to the kind of technologies or even the scientific advances, because of their holism and their spirituality, they have to be approached in a very personal way. Like you can't just study them with some sort of scientific objective distance. To really experience them in their true power, you have to involve yourself and you have to be implicated in what it is you're studying. And that's a really risky thing to do as well. So I think it's going to take a while longer, but we might get there. We might get there, especially if with everything that's happening with climate change, all of the global emergencies that we are starting to live through, maybe that will open more of us up to approaching the world in this more holistic spiritual way, and be less worried about control and more about opening our spirits.
Great answer. And Dr. Rawlette, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me today. I really learned a lot from you and really enjoyed this conversation. So I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. And for everybody else, please take one moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to go to beyondbelief.blog and sign up for our newsletter and stay on top of all the great things that we have happening here at Beyond Belief. And thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye.